Have you ever wondered what it means to be truly seen? Not for the labels slapped upon you by a cruel world, or the value assigned by calloused hands, but for the silent strength that resides within a broken spirit. This is a story about a girl with dust on her ankles and a past she didn't choose, and a man whose own heart was a map of silent sorrows. It's a story about how two fractured souls in a place, forgotten by most, found a way not just to survive, but to rewrite the ending they were handed. She was barefoot when they brought her out, dust-caked and brown from years of relentless sun, and unforgiving earth clung to her ankles like a second skin. No bonnet to shield her face, no shawl to hide the tremor in her hands, just a sun-faded dress that had long surrendered its shape. And a silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that could make even the most hardened drunkard look away uneasy. They tied her to the post with a frayed rope, the same kind they'd used for restless horses, and the wood was already scarred from others who had stood there before her. She didn't resist, didn't blink. Her back was straight, a defiant line against the sagging porch of the auction house, chin held low, not in submission, but as if studying the very dirt that had claimed so much of her life. The town square, a wretched hive of curiosity and casual cruelty, leaned in. The auctioneer, a man whose voice was as worn as his hat, cleared his throat, shuffled papers that held no real importance, and bellowed into the slow simmering heat of the afternoon. 19 strong, no known ailments, can work long hours field or house, and best of all, doesn't talk back. A harsh laugh cut through the air. A woman in a plum skirt, fanning herself with performative delicacy despite the still air, muttered something sharp and sanctimonious. The girl said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the ground, a small patch of earth that offered no judgment, no escape. Off to the side, propped against the saloon rail, like a discarded scarecrow, her mother watched. Arms crossed, lips pursed into a tight, bitter line, as if she were trying to hold back a mouthful of venom. Her eyes, clouded with cheap liquor and a lifetime of disappointment, stared at her own daughter, as if she were nothing more than a broken rake, an inconvenience to be discarded. The sun beat down, but the mother's gaze was a colder, sharper pain. "She ain't worth much," the mother slurred, her voice thick and ugly. "But I'm tired of feeding her. She's yours long as you take her today. Good riddance." Whispers like dry leaves skittering across a barren field started then. That one, the orphan from out past Dry Creek, thought she ran off with a traitor, once came back quieter than a church mouse. No kin but the woman who sells her off like a sack of flour. Ain't never seen her smile, not once. The auctioneer, unfazed, merely scanned the crowd. "Who will take the girl? She works quiet, eats little, doesn't ask for more." A pitiful offering for a human life. No one raised a hand. Not at first. A few men, their eyes lingering with a predatory interest, looked, then quickly looked away, perhaps shamed by the public display, or perhaps calculating the cost against the meager reward. A shopkeeper chuckled a dry, rasping sound and shook his head. One lanky boy whispered something crude about used goods and was promptly elbowed in the ribs by his mother, her face a mask of propriety that barely concealed her own morbid curiosity. The girl continued to stare at the ground, her stillness a testament to a life spent expecting nothing and rarely being disappointed. Then a shadow detached itself from the periphery of the crowd. A tall man clad in a worn brown duster that spoke of long roads and solitary journeys. No one had seen him arrive. He seemed to materialize from the heat haze itself. He leaned on the railing by the blacksmith's forge, hat pulled low, obscuring his features, his hand resting steady on the worn wood. Dust coated his boots, not the fresh dust of the town, but the ingrained grime of some older, forgotten road. A hushed murmur rippled through the onlookers. "Ain't that the widower from South Ridge? Thought he sold his cattle. Ain't got no help now, has he? Maybe he's just here to watch." But he didn't just watch. He straightened, and with a deliberate slowness that drew every eye, he stepped forward. One hand lifted, barely a gesture, a slight inclination of his fingers, but it shattered the oppressive hush like a gunshot. "I'll take her," he said. His voice wasn't loud nor soft, just steady, firm. The auctioneer blinked momentarily, surprised. "You'll take her?" The man nodded once. She yours to sell, he directed at the mother. She snorted a dismissive, ugly sound. She's mine to be rid of. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching on the parched earth. He produced a few coins from a worn leather pouch. Not a fortune, not even a bargain, just enough. He didn't untie her right away. He just looked at her, his gaze unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. She didn't meet his eyes. She looked instead at the rope biting into her wrists, at the dirt, at anything but the man who now owned her. He took out a pocket knife, the metal glinting dully in the sun. Slow and careful, he cut the rope. She didn't flinch, didn't react at all, as if her body had forgotten how to respond to kindness, or even simple action not born of malice. He didn't touch her beyond what was necessary. You hurt? He asked, his voice still low and even. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. You got a name? No answer. He didn't press. Don't matter, he said more to himself than to her. He stepped back. There's a wagon waiting. You come or you stay. Your choice. For a single stretched heartbeat, she didn't move. The crowd held its breath, a collective intake of air, thick with unspoken judgment and anticipation. Then slowly, as if testing limbs long, unused to freedom, she stepped off the crate. Her knees nearly buckled. She swayed, catching herself with a visible effort. He didn't offer an arm. He didn't offer platitudes. But he walked beside her, his long strides deliberately slowed to match her tired, uncertain pace. And together, wordlessly, they left the square, the weight of 1,000 curious, condemning eyes pressing down on their backs. No one stopped them. No one dared. They reached the wagon. Wooden plane, a single restless mule hitched to it. He helped her into the back, a brief impersonal touch on her elbow. He passed her a canteen, said nothing else. The town with its harsh laughter and silent judgments faded behind them, swallowed by dust and heat. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't speak at all. But she drank the water, drank it like it was holy, like it was the first clean thing she'd tasted in an age. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she let herself breathe a shallow, ragged inhale, but a breath nonetheless. The trail stretched out before them, a ribbon of silence winding through a landscape that was both beautiful and brutal. Afternoon turned to amber, then gold, then a bruised, tender dusk. Shadows, long and cool, climbed up from the tall grass and clung to the wagon wheels. He drove without hurry, his hands sure on the reins, his posture relaxed but alert. She sat cross-legged in the wagon bed, watching the road vanish behind them each mile, a small severing from a past she yearned to escape, but couldn't yet comprehend leaving. No tears pricked her eyes. No obvious fear contorted her features. Just a quietness, a stillness too heavy, too old for a girl her age. It was the quiet of a soul that had learned to retreat so far inside itself that the outside world barely registered. When the mule finally slowed to a stop, the sky had deepened to a soft lavender stars beginning to prick the vast canvas above. In the distance, a weather-beaten house leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing against the wind. It was flanked by a dying oak, its branches skeletal against the fading light, and a barn that looked older than both. This is it, he said, his voice breaking the long silence. She didn't answer. A lit lantern, its glow warm and inviting in the twilight, helped her down from the wagon. Her legs felt like lead. Kitchen's through there, he gestured with his chin. Your room's upstairs. You hungry? She shook her head. The thought of food was alien. You clean. Another nod. He opened the front door, held it for her. Inside it smelled of cedar wood, old ash from the hearth, and something else. Something like loneliness. There were no lace curtains, no doilies, no feminine touches, just wooden floors, rough-hewn, worn furniture, and a single small picture nailed above the hearth, too faded in the dim light to make out its subject. You don't know me, he said, stating the obvious, yet it felt like something more. I know, she replied, her voice thin, dry as dust. It was the first time he truly heard it. He pointed to a narrow staircase. Top of the steps, left room. She went up each step, a conscious effort. She didn't close the door to her room behind her, perhaps too accustomed to doors being closed on her. He didn't follow. He respected the space, or perhaps he understood the need for it. In the morning, long before the sun had fully crested the ridge, He found her already at the sink washing the few mugs they owned. Her movements were economical, practiced. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice a little rough from sleep. She replied without turning her focus on the task. "I don't mind." They ate breakfast, stale bread and weak coffee, in a silence that was different from the silence of the trail. This silence was watchful, tentative. No questions were asked, no small talk offered. She noticed his slight limp, more pronounced in the morning. He noticed the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when the wind slammed the door shut unexpectedly. He saw the ghost of old hurts in that tiny movement. Later, she tried to sweep the porch. The old broom handle, brittle with age, snapped. He took it from her, fixed it without a word, his calloused hands surprisingly deft. She folded the threadbare towels into neat, precise squares, kept her voice locked in her throat, afraid that any sound might break the fragile peace. When the night air grew cold, he brought her an old mended shawl, laying it over the banister at the foot of the stairs. He never told her to wear it, never drew attention to the gesture. And so the days passed, not with drama or pronouncements, but with a quiet rhythm, a silence that wasn't empty anymore. It was a silence that was waiting, waiting for what neither of them knew. She began to notice the small things, how he always fed the mule first, a gentle murmur in his voice as he did, how he touched the weathered fence posts sometimes as if greeting old friends, how he said good night at the same time every evening, a low rumble from his room, even when she never said it back. He noticed things too, how she winced at the sound of distant thunder, a shadow crossing her face, how she meticulously peeled the crusts off her bread before eating it, a habit born of scarcity perhaps, or something darker. How she often stayed outside long after sunset, staring at the vast empty horizon, as if it might offer an escape or a promise of something better than she had ever known. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the crickets a deafening chorus in the cool air, she finally asked the question that had been hovering between them like an unspoken word. "Why'd you take me?" He didn't answer right away. He just poured lukewarm coffee into 2 tin mugs, handed her one. The steam curled between her fingers, a fleeting warmth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Because no one else did." She stared into the dark liquid in her mug. "You could have picked someone prettier." She whispered the words, barely audible, a confession of her own perceived worthlessness. He didn't blink, didn't look away. "Didn't need pretty. What did you need?" She pressed a flicker of something, curiosity, defiance in her eyes. He looked out toward the dark silhouette of the barn, toward the memories that haunted its shadows. "Someone who wouldn't leave." She didn't say anything more that night. But the next evening, she didn't sit quite so far from him on the porch. The girl with dust on her ankles, the girl sold like chattel, had come to a house that didn't ask questions, only offered quiet space. And the man who thought he had nothing left to give had unknowingly made room for someone he didn't expect to keep. Neither of them would have dared to name it hope. Not yet. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. But that worn porch under a bruised purple sky, pricked with indifferent stars, held 2 chairs. And for the first time in a long, long time, both of them were filled. The girl whose name he still didn't know woke to a light she didn't expect. It filtered through the thin, mended muslin curtains, pale and soft, as though even the morning was trying not to startle her. The old bed creaked when she sat up, her body stiff from unfamiliar comfort. She half expected a knock, a shout, a demand. None came. Downstairs, the house moved with its old slow rhythms. Floorboards groaned a familiar song. Somewhere a kettle began to whisper. The rancher was already outside. She could hear the distant rhythmic clang of a hammer. She folded the quilt over the thin mattress the way she'd always done. Edges tight, corners squared like a soldier's bed. Habit ingrained from a life where order, any semblance of control, was a small act of survival. The kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's bread, a surprisingly comforting aroma. A note sat on the rough-hewn table, penned in a strong, masculine hand. "Coffee's on. I'm in the barn. Feed's in the trough if you're up for it." No signature. No instructions beyond what mattered. She read it twice, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar script, before carefully folding it and slipping it into the pocket of her worn apron. And then a strange thing happened. Her shoulders, usually held so taut, so ready for a blow or a harsh word, slumped just slightly, as if an invisible string inside her had been loosened just a fraction. Outside, the morning was quiet. Not an oppressive quiet, but a welcoming one filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. She followed the trail of his footprints toward the barn, each one deep and careful, as though the man who made them carried burdens he never spoke of. He didn't look up when she entered the cavernous space, just kept hammering a bent hinge back into place on a stall door. Sunlight slanting through the slats in the barn wall painted golden stripes across the dusty floor. Dust motes danced in the beams like tiny benevolent ghosts. "I can help," she said, her voice still quiet but firmer than before. He didn't stop working. "You sure?" She nodded. "I'm used to work." It was an understatement of a lifetime. He gestured with his chin toward a pile of hay. "Pitch it out if you like. Fresh bedding stacked near the wall." No comment on how she'd slept. No questions about her past. Just space, acceptance. That was his way. They worked like that for hours. Him repairing the broken stall door, his movements economical and precise despite his limp. Her shoveling out old hay and spreading fresh, the air between them light and unspoken. A rhythm began to form, not quite harmony but not dissonance either. Just two people each lost in their own way, doing what they knew how to do, existing in the same space without demanding anything from the other. By midday, sweat had curled strands of her dark hair around her neck. She didn't ask for water. Asking felt like a weakness she couldn't afford. He handed her a tin cup without a word, their fingers brushing for the briefest of moments. It was nothing. It was something. A flicker of human connection in the vast emptiness. She drank, handed it back, their eyes meeting for a fleeting second before she looked away. Later, she stood by the fence arms draped over the top rail, watching the wind stir the tall grass in the pasture, making it sway like a gentle green ocean. It reminded her of a mother stroking a child's hair, a tenderness she had never known. He came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort rather than an intrusion. "You built all this?" she asked, her voice soft, directed at the horizon more than at him. He nodded once. "Most of it, with her." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. "Why?" she asked, not prying, but genuinely curious about the force that drove a man to carve a life out of such unforgiving land. He stared ahead, his gaze distant. "Because someone had to, and I was still here." She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. The sorrow in his voice was a language she understood all too well. That evening, she chopped carrots for a stew while he brought in firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a counterpoint to the bubbling pot. The air inside the small kitchen thickened with the scent of simmering vegetables, wood smoke, and something else. A nascent sense of domesticity. The house no longer felt entirely hollow. It felt paused like a song, waiting for its next verse, uncertain what tune it might take. She noticed things. How he always placed his worn boots side by side neatly by the door. How he never slammed a cupboard, his movements surprisingly gentle for such a large man. How his hands, calloused and cracked from years of labor, could move with an unexpected care when handling a delicate cup or mending a broken tool. He noticed things too. How she turned her face toward the warmth of the fire, like a starved plant seeking the sun, as though she'd been cold for years, chilled to the very bone. How she always took the cracked plate, the smaller portion of food, her movements self-effacing, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. How she listened more than she spoke, her eyes wide and watchful, as though words themselves had once been weapons used against her. The next morning, she found a neatly folded cloth left on the kitchen table. It was a new apron stitched by hand from rough but clean fabric. Not fine, not fancy, but thoughtful. Incredibly, impossibly thoughtful. She traced the uneven hem with her fingertips, her touch reverent as if it were spun from gold. A knot formed in her throat, tight and painful. It was the first gift she could remember receiving that wasn't a prelude to pain. By the third day, she knew the pattern of his steps on the porch. He knew the faint, almost inaudible sound of her hum when she peeled apples for a pie she'd hesitantly offered to bake. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things that didn't need saying, of shared tasks and unspoken understanding. But the ghosts, they still lingered. He passed by a narrow closed door at the end of the hallway each night, without touching it, without even looking at it directly. She noticed the way his eyes darkened almost imperceptibly when his gaze accidentally fell upon it, the way his jaw tightened for just a fleeting second. Once driven by a curiosity she couldn't quell, she reached for the doorknob. It was locked. Later she asked him about it, her voice carefully neutral. That room used to be her room, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet filled with it all the same. No name, no explanation. She didn't press. She understood about locked rooms, about places too painful to enter. That night, as she lay in her own small bed, the unfamiliar softness of the mattress beneath her, she thought about all the rooms she'd been locked in. The ones with boards nailed across the windows. The ones where words like property and payment hung in the air like suffocating smoke. And now here she was in a room with an unlocked door, free to leave, yet too uncertain, too tethered by an invisible thread to move. In the middle of the week it rained. A sudden, violent downpour, as if the sky itself had finally decided it couldn't hold its sorrow together any longer. She stepped outside onto the porch, then deliberately walked into the deluge, lifting her face to the cleansing torrent. She let it soak her, let it baptize the parts of her that still dared to believe she might be worth something. He watched from the dry shelter of the porch, his expression unreadable, still and silent. Then without a word he took off his own worn coat, walked over to where she stood drenched and shivering, and draped it across her shoulders. Its warmth, its scent of him, wood smoke and earth, enveloped her. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. He didn't pull away. That night, for the first time, they didn't eat in silence. Hesitantly, haltingly, she told him about the first field she'd ever worked in, how her small hands had bled that day, raw and blistered, and no one had noticed, no one had cared. He in turn told her about a foal born too early, too weak, about how he'd stayed up 3 nights straight, nursing it, willing it to live only for it to die in his arms anyway. They didn't cry, not then, but something softened between them, like the first thaw beneath a long winter's snow. Still, neither of them reached out. Neither of them dared to name what was growing in the fragile space between them, but they both knew. They both felt it. The next day, the town sent word, a cruel reminder of the world beyond their isolated sanctuary. A gossiping neighbor, eyes sharp and tongue sharper, had seen her, the auction girl and Mernto, at the rancher's place. A man burly and arrogant came by his pockets, jingling with coin, offering to take her off his hands, assuming she was merely temporarily borrowed, a commodity to be used and returned. The rancher didn't reply with fists, though his hands clenched at his sides. He just stood tall, his voice low and dangerous. "She's under my roof. You'll leave now, and you won't come back." The man, sensing a resolve he hadn't expected, grumbled, but retreated. That night the silence was heavier. "Why do they hate me?" She asked the question raw, with a pain that went deeper than any physical blow. He didn't answer right away, just stared into the dying embers of the fire. Then, "Because you remind them of something they don't have the guts to look at in themselves. That they'd trade a daughter for coin. That they'd let it happen, and some would even laugh." She looked at him, then truly looked at him, and saw not pity, but a shared understanding, a weariness that mirrored her own. She saw something in his weathered face that made her feel for the first time a little less alone in her shame. "I'm not broken," she said quietly, more to convince herself than him. "I know," he replied, his voice gentle. "I'm just tired." "I know that too." Then they sat on the porch again, the 2 chairs a little closer this time. Not close enough to touch, but not an ocean apart either. And the house, old and aching, seemed to breathe with them. Just once, a long, slow exhale. That night she left the door between their rooms cracked open just an inch. Not as an invitation, not yet, but as trust, a fragile, nascent trust. He noticed, but he didn't step through. They weren't ready for that. But the floorboards between them no longer felt like an impassable chasm. And for now that was enough. The sky was already heavy brooding when they hitched the wagon a few days later. Clouds, bloated and bruised, hovered above the ridge like something malevolent waiting to break. The girl stood at the porch rail, her fingers twisting the worn fabric of the shawl he'd given her, watching the distant hazy outline of the town, as though it might vanish if she blinked, or worse, reach out and reclaim her. He stepped beside her, pulling on his coat. "You still want to go?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We need flour, salt, maybe some thread." It was a practical litany, a shield against the fear churning inside her. He nodded back. No lecture, no expressed worry, just quiet agreement. They rode in a silence that was familiar now, each jolt of the wagon on the rutted trail absorbed into their bones. She sat straighter than she used to, he noticed, her chin a little higher, and she noticed he sometimes glanced at her hands when he passed her the reins, as if checking to be sure the calluses were healing, that the rawness was fading. When they reached the town, the wind had picked up, carrying with it a sense of unease. People noticed them this time. Not just covert glances, but open stares that lasted longer than decency allowed. "She's the one," someone murmured loud enough to carry. "That auction girl." The words were like stones, sharp and bruising. They walked side by side into the general store. The bell over the door jangled once, then echoed in the sudden, uncomfortable silence. The shopkeeper, a man with shifty eyes and a smile that didn't reach them, looked up. "Back for seed, Mr. "No," the rancher said, his voice even. "Just supplies." The girl moved quietly through the narrow aisles, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. She picked up what they needed, measured the sugar with careful, steady fingers, trying to make herself as small, as invisible as possible. But when she reached for a spool of dark blue sewing thread, another hand wrinkled and adorned with a garish ring shot out and slapped hers away. "You don't touch nothing delicate," a woman the shopkeeper's wife sneered. She was younger than the girl's mother, but her cruelty seemed far older, more deeply ingrained. "This ain't no brothel's pantry for the likes of you." The girl froze her breath, catching halfway to her lungs. The sting on her hand was nothing compared to the cold shame that washed over her. The shopkeeper busied himself behind the counter, deliberately not interfering. The rancher stepped forward slow and steady, placing himself between the girl and her accuser. "That's enough." The woman huffed, undeterred. "You're the one who bought her. What's it matter to you what she touches? She's soiled goods." He said nothing at first, just looked at the girl's hand, at the redness blooming across her knuckles. Then his gaze cold as winter steel lifted to the woman. "You speak to her like that again," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "and you'll wish I'd only raised my voice." They left without the thread. The wagon ride back was quieter than usual, a heavy, suffocating silence. She kept her face turned toward the horizon, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Sorry," he said, finally breaking the tension. She shook her head, not looking at him. "You didn't do it." A pause. "Didn't stop it either, not really." Her eyes stung, but she wouldn't let the tears fall. "Not here. Not now." "I'm tired," she whispered, her voice raw. "Tired of being looked at like I'm something to scrub off a boot." "You ain't," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. She finally turned to him, her eyes blazing with a sudden, desperate fire. "Then what am I? Tell me, what am I to you, to anyone?" He took his time, the wagon creaking beneath them. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. "You're what they're afraid to admit they threw away," he said at last. "You're the good they couldn't see or didn't want to." Rain started as they crossed the final bend toward the ranch. Soft at first, like hesitant breath, then louder, angrier, until it smacked against the canvas top of the wagon like furious fists. Thunder, a deep, guttural crack split the sky. The mule, normally placid, spooked, shying violently. The wheels skidded in the suddenly slick mud. He pulled on the reins hard, fighting for control. "We'll have to shelter at the barn," he yelled over the roar of the storm. They unhitched the frantic mule with desperate speed, rain soaking through their sleeves, their skirts, their skin in seconds. She ran ahead, her light frame battling the wind, and flung open the heavy barn doors. He stumbled just behind, slipping once on the muddy threshold, catching himself against the door frame with a sharp grunt of pain. Inside, the storm raged with a primal fury. Wind howled through the rafters like a banshee. The mule brayed nervously in its stall. Water dripped through a dozen cracks in the old roof, a familiar litany of disrepair. They stood just inside, soaked to the bone, panting, her dark hair plastered to her neck, and face his shirt clinging to every scar on his broad back. "Why did you say that to her?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the tempest. "In the store, because it was true." "But you don't know me," she insisted, turning to face him, her eyes searching his. "I know enough." She shook her head, a wild desperation in her gesture. "No, you don't. You don't know what I've done, what I've let happen to me. I don't need to know the particulars, he said, his gaze steady. But I need you to, she cried, the words torn from her. I need you to know. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited, letting the silence punctuated by the storm's fury fall between them like the driving rain. Then tell me, he said finally, his voice a low rumble. She looked away toward the rain-lashed shadows of the barn, took a ragged breath, then another. I was 15, she began, her voice a raw whisper. The first time my mother's friend, offered me to another man. My mother, she took the coin. Her voice cracked. Said I was old enough. Said this world don't give out favors to girls who try to stay soft. She waited for him to flinch, to turn away in disgust. He didn't. His expression remained unchanged, his eyes fixed on her. She continued, the words tumbling out now, a torrent of shame and pain held back for too long. I tried to run. They caught me, locked me in a shed for 3 days. No water, just darkness. When they let me out, I didn't fight anymore. I couldn't. Her voice broke completely. I stopped counting the men after the 6th. Still, he didn't speak, didn't move. She stepped closer to him, then her hands shaking, her body trembling. You bought me, she accused, her voice laced with a bitter despair. Same as them. Maybe you were nicer about it, but it was the same thing, wasn't it? No, he said, his voice firm, cutting through her anguish. No, I didn't buy you. You handed over money. I paid, he corrected, his gaze intense, to end something, to stop what they were doing to you. She stared at him, her chest heaving, confusion warring with a desperate, unbelievable flicker of hope. He looked at her, then not with pity, but with a profound, aching understanding, the way a man looks at lightning in the distance, awed by its power, perhaps a little afraid of it, but willing to stand there unflinching, just the same. I didn't know your story then, he said quietly. Still don't know all of it, but I could see the ending they were writing for you, and I didn't like it. And you think you get to change that, she whispered, her voice raw. No, he said, his eyes holding hers. I think you do. The barn creaked and groaned under the relentless assault of wind and thunder. Then, with a sickening sound, the roof above them gave a mighty groan. A section near the hayloft buckled, timbers splintering. He looked up, his eyes widening, just as a heavy support beam loosened by the storm began to fall. Look out, she screamed, instinct taking over. He reacted instantly, shoving her hard to the side. The heavy beam struck his shoulder with a sickening thud. He fell hard into the muddy earth of the barn floor. She scrambled to him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Don't move, don't. I'm fine, he rasped, his face contorted in pain. You're not. She knelt beside him, heedless of the mud and water, and gently cradled his head in her lap. Blood, dark and ominous, was already seeping through the fabric of his sleeve. You're bleeding. It's not bad. It is. You're crying, he said, his voice weak, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. She was. She hadn't even realized it. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain. I didn't want you to get hurt, she choked out. I'd rather get hurt, he whispered, his eyes cloudy with pain, but fixed on hers, than watch you get dragged back to that hell. She blinked, trembling from cold, from fear, from an emotion so overwhelming she couldn't name it. You said I could change the ending. I believe that, he affirmed, his voice fading slightly. She pressed her forehead to his, her tears falling onto his face. Then stay alive for it, she pleaded, her voice fierce. Stay alive. He chuckled, a weak rattling sound, but undeniably real. That's, a fine order, ma'am. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean, glistening under a pale, hesitant sun. Light returned in cautious golden strips through the damaged rafters of the barn. He sat propped against a barrel, his shoulder roughly bandaged with strips torn from her petticoat. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. She brought him coffee, strong and hot, and handed it to him without a word. He took it, their fingers brushing again. This time she didn't pull away. He didn't either. The barn was broken in places. The house was still standing. And somehow so were they. The morning came soft, as if the land itself were holding its breath after the night's fury. Mist clung low across the field like a silvery memory, refusing to lift. In the barn, the girl sat cross-legged beside the rancher. Both of them were wrapped in the profound silence that follows survival, a silence different from any they had known before. She held a tin mug of coffee in her hands, no longer just for warmth, but as something steadier, a ritual. His bandage was soaked through again, near the shoulder. He hadn't complained. He hadn't asked for help. Still, she brought him fresh water and gently checked the wound, her touch surprisingly practiced from forgotten years of tending to others who had never thanked her, never even seen her. "You should rest. In the house," she said, her voice low. He shook his head, wincing. "Roof needs patching first." "You almost died." The words were flat heavy with the memory. He looked out the barn door toward the pale, fragile spread of morning light. "Almost is not the same as did." Her breath caught not at the words themselves, but at the quiet, unshakable calm with which he said them. She stood, wiped her damp hands on her apron, then looked at him, really looked at him with the kind of direct, unwavering stare a person gives when there's no longer anything left to hide, nothing left to lose. "I need to leave," she said, not a question, a statement. He didn't flinch, didn't show surprise, just met her gaze. "You can." "I'm not saying I want to," she clarified, her voice tight. "I'm saying I need to. There's a difference." "I know. Why aren't you stopping me? Why aren't you angry?" He looked down at his bandaged shoulder, then back at her. "Because needing to go means you haven't yet chosen to stay. And choice, girl, that's the only thing that truly matters." She swallowed hard. That quiet, understanding answer hurt more than any anger or argument could have. He rose slowly, pain etching lines around his eyes, but he hid it as he always hid his pain. "I'll pack the wagon," he said. "I wasn't asking for your help." "I'm not offering it as help," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "I'm giving it. There's a difference there, too." By midday, her meager satchel was packed. It didn't contain much, a few worn clothes, the spool of dark blue thread he'd quietly gone back to town to buy for her after their disastrous trip, leaving it on her pillow without a word, and the new apron he'd stitched, which she'd ripped on a nail while helping with the storm repairs. He stood beside the mule reins in hand, waiting. She stepped down the porch steps, each one feeling heavier than the last, and paused. The house behind her, the house that had offered her a fragile sanctuary, loomed larger than ever, not in size but in significance. "Damn it," she muttered, her voice thick. "I told myself I wouldn't cry." "You should be able to leave however you need to," he said gently, not looking at her. She climbed into the wagon, her movements stiff. He didn't say goodbye, didn't ask if she'd write or where she'd go. He just nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible movement, and turned back toward the barn, toward the unending work that awaited him. But the mule, the stubborn, placid mule, didn't move. She yanked the reins a little harder than necessary. Nothing. She tried again, clucking her tongue. Still nothing. The creature stood as if rooted to the earth. The rancher looked back, a curious expression on his face. "He won't go." "Why not?" she asked, frustration lacing her voice. "Because he was born here," the rancher said, walking slowly back toward the wagon. "And animals. Well, animals often know when they're carrying someone who doesn't really want to leave." She stared at the mule, then up at the vast, indifferent sky, then down at her own trembling hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission torn from the deepest part of her. "I'm so scared. I know. I thought, I thought leaving would make me feel free, but all I feel is empty, more empty than before." "That's because freedom ain't about going somewhere else, girl," he said, his voice soft. "It's about choosing where you want to stand, and why." She climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. She walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away, the space between them charged with unspoken words. What if I stayed?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. He didn't move, didn't rush to answer. His gaze was steady, searching. "Then," he said finally, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "I reckon I'd have to build a new fence line." She almost laughed, a watery choke sound. "Why, because," he said, his eyes holding hers, "it wouldn't just be my land anymore, would it?" Her voice dropped, hesitant, vulnerable. Would I be your wife?" He looked at her then with that same steady, unwavering expression he'd worn in town at the auction in every quiet shared moment between them. Not unless you want to be. That choice, like all the others, has to be yours. She stepped closer, bridging the small gap between them. What if I don't know how to be one, a wife? What if I'm too broken? Then we figure it out, he said simply. Together. He extended his hand palm up, not as a demand, not as a claim, but as a question, an invitation. And for the first time in her life, truly the first time, she answered one, without fear, without coercion. She placed her hand in his. It fit. The wedding, if you could call it that, happened before the sun dipped fully behind the western ridge, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft rose. There were no guests, no preacher, no fancy dress. Just two hands calloused and worn bound by a shared breath and a quiet, unshakable grace. They stood by the small, clear creek that ran behind the house, the water moving slow and golden wide, like time itself had paused to listen. He asked, his voice a low rumble. You sure about this, girl? She nodded, her eyes clear and fixed on his. I'm not clean. She said the words, a quiet confession. I'm not new. I'm not whole. I'm not asking for any of that, he replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. I'm only just learning how to be good, she whispered. I'd be scared of someone who already thought they knew it all, he said. They didn't kiss then. That they both knew would come later in its own time when the foundations were truly set. Instead, they built a small fire by the creek bank, cooked beans and bacon over the open flame. And she, with a new resolve in her eyes, pulled out the old faded scarf he'd never asked about, the one she'd kept hidden deep in her satchel. It smelled faintly of her first home, her worst memories, her mother's indifference. Without a word, she threw it into the fire, watched the flames lick at it, consume it, until it was nothing but ash. He didn't ask, but she whispered, her voice catching, it was my mother's. The flame crackled, spat, and then it was gone. A small, symbolic severing. Later, as twilight deepened, he brought her to the porch. He'd sanded one of the old rickety chairs clean that morning, a silent offering. She sat. He sat beside her in his own familiar chair. The sky turned from amber to a deep, bruised purple. The last of the light poured itself across the silent fields like warm honey on old linen. She turned to him, her voice trembling, but true. I think I want to belong here. He looked straight ahead at the land that was now theirs. Then you already do. She reached out slowly, deliberately, and touched the back of his hand, where it rested on the arm of his chair. Not softly, not shyly, but with a firmness that spoke of a decision made, a place claimed. The wind picked up a gentle sigh, carrying the scent of pine, of ash, of turned earth. And the porch, once a place where only silence and sorrow kept vigil, now held something new. A vow unspoken, but more real, more binding than any words. Before the sun had fully set, she had not just stayed, she had chosen. And in the choosing, she had begun to change the very shape of her name, of her soul. The mornings were different now, not because the sun rose any slower or the wind stopped its ceaseless sweeping across the vast open fields, but because she rose with it, with purpose, with breath that didn't hitch in her chest, with a quiet sense of belonging. She moved through the small house like someone claiming it, not with noise or demands, but with her hands, her presence. She polished the scarred kitchen table until it gleamed faintly a warm, dull gray. She found old flour sacks, and with the blue thread he'd bought, stitched new simple curtains for the kitchen window, humming soft, tuneless notes while the stew simmered or the bread baked. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It answered her touch. It began to breathe with her. He repaired the storm-damaged barn beam, his movements slower than they might have been in his younger, uninjured years, but steadier somehow, more deliberate. She often watched him from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, her chin tilted slightly, not to judge his work, but to memorize the line of his shoulders, the way he limped slightly on his right side, the way he tapped each nail twice with the hammer before striking it true. She memorized the comfortable silence that surrounded him, a silence that was never lonely, always full. They shared the work easily, naturally. She milked the single cow in the dewy mornings, her hands surprisingly strong and gentle. He chopped wood at dusk, the rhythmic thud a comforting heartbeat in the fading light. And when their fingers brushed, passing dishes or tools or the reins to the mule, neither pulled away. Sometimes they spoke simple words about the weather, the crops, the animals. Other times they didn't need to. The words had changed between them, and so had the pauses now filled with unspoken understanding instead of fear or uncertainty. One morning she found a small, crudely made wooden box on her windowsill. It was sanded smooth with no latch. Her heart gave a little flutter. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of clean cloth, lay three items: a single pressed wildflower, its color faded but its form perfect, a small faded piece of blue ribbon, perhaps from his late wife's belongings, and a folded piece of paper. The handwriting, strong and a little uneven, was his. She unfolded it carefully. It read, "You're not what they named you. You're not even just what you survived. You're what you choose to build from the wreckage. And you, girl, you build strong." She pressed the note to her chest, and for the first time since she was a child, she let herself cry. Not tears of shame or pain or fear, but tears of recognition, of being seen, truly seen. Later that week, a neighbor came by. One of the women from town who used to glance too long, her whispers too low and too cruel. This time she came hesitantly, carrying a jar of peach preserves as a peace offering. She asked, her voice surprisingly timid, if the missus, and she looked directly at the girl, might have the skill and the kindness to help sew a christening gown for her newborn niece. The girl didn't just say yes. She looked the woman in the eye, a quiet dignity in her gaze, and said, "I would be honored." And just like that, with those simple words, the world, their small corner of it, shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. The days passed, settling into a rhythm as comfortable as an old quilt. One evening, as the wind turned colder and the leaves on the cottonwood trees began to rust and fall, he found her sitting on the porch steps, her bare feet resting on the cool earth. She wore the old shawl he'd given her, but differently now, draped loosely, confidently around her shoulders. She was staring up at the vast, star-dusted sky as if it owed her nothing, and she, in turn, owed it no fear. He sat beside her on the step below, not speaking. After a long, comfortable silence, she turned her head. "I don't think I could go back," she said, her voice soft. "You don't need to," he replied. "I mean," she clarified, "not just to that town. I mean, to who I was before." "You buried her," he said gently, "under the ashes of that scarf." She nodded, a small, wistful smile touching her lips. "I didn't even say a proper goodbye." "Some goodbyes don't need words," he said. "They just need letting go." They sat there until the sun dipped low, turning everything to golden shadow. That night, as they lay side by side in the wide bed, they now shared, not yet touching, but not apart, the space between them, filled with a new warm intimacy. She whispered into the darkness, "I've never felt safe before." "Not really, not like this." He answered without opening his eyes, his voice a sleepy murmur. "That's what a home is supposed to be, girl. Safe." She smiled, a genuine, unshadowed smile that reached her eyes and turned slightly toward him. I think I love this house," she said. And it was true, because it wasn't just walls and a roof anymore. It was the place where her name had finally taken shape, where her worth had been returned to her piece by trembling, hard-won peace. The house, like her, had once been silent, haunted, holding too many ghosts. Now it breathed, it lived. 1 week later, they rode into town again. Not for supplies this time, not for apologies, and certainly not for sale. This time they went for paper. Marriage papers, signed in quiet, steady ink in the dusty, indifferent office of the county clerk. Witnessed by no one but the wind whistling through the eaves, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, and the patient old mule that had carried them both through so much. The clerk, a new younger man, raised an eyebrow at the unlikely pair, but perhaps sensing a story he didn't need to know, said nothing beyond the necessary. On the way home, she leaned against his shoulder, not out of need this time, but out of simple, uncomplicated want. Back at the ranch, their ranch, she took off her boots at the door and stepped barefoot onto the familiar wooden floor. She touched the doorframe, the wall, the kitchen table, as if reacquainting herself with the feel of her own skin, her own life. And when she turned to him, standing there in the doorway, as he always did, his hat in his hand, his gaze low but warm, she simply said, her voice clear and strong, "Welcome home." He blinked, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "It's yours too, you know." Always was from the moment you chose it. That night he took down the faded, indistinct photograph that had hung above the fireplace for so long. He didn't burn it. He didn't hide it away in anger or shame. He simply gently placed it in a drawer, closed it with a quiet click, and opened up a space on the wall, a space for something new. She noticed, of course. She didn't speak of it, but later that week she hung a single, simply stitched piece of cloth in its place. Nothing fancy, just two names side by side, hers and his, stitched in that same dark blue thread. And beneath them, a single powerful word: enough. Fall arrived slow and golden, painting the landscape in hues of amber and crimson. They stacked firewood high against the barn wall, and canned peaches from the few gnarled trees in the neglected orchard she was slowly bringing back to life. She, with painstaking patience, taught him to read cursive from an old tattered primer she'd found. He in turn taught her to patch leather, his large hands guiding hers with surprising gentleness. They argued once a small, sharp disagreement about where to plant the winter kale. But when the wind howled like a wolf outside their door that night, they sat close by the crackling fire, sharing the last biscuit between them, the argument forgotten, their comfortable silence restored. They no longer needed permission to take up space in the world or in each other's lives. And that perhaps was the greatest miracle of all. Because in a world that had once auctioned her worth like common chattel, she had claimed her place, her value, her name. In a house once hollowed by loss and unbearable grief, he had learned slowly, painstakingly, how to love again, without fear, without reservation. She wasn't saved by him. She rose on her own with his hand steady beside hers. He wasn't healed by her presence alone. He chose to stay open, to risk his heart again anyway. And the house, their house, it finally truly breathed. Not just with life, but with meaning, with peace, with a quiet, resilient joy. And if you happen to pass by it today, that small, weather-beaten house just past the ridge, where the cottonwoods lean and whisper secrets to the wind, you'd see the porch light glowing warmly even at dusk. You might hear laughter, soft and unforced, drifting on the breeze. You'd see two chairs on that porch, always filled, always close. And maybe, just maybe, if the wind was right, you'd hear the old floorboards sigh like old bones settling into something warm, something lasting. And perhaps you think, just maybe, that some broken things don't need fixing in the way we imagine. Sometimes they just need naming. They need seeing. They need a safe place to finally truly breathe. So here's to the naming, to understanding that we are not what they called us, not what was done to us. We are what we carried through the fire, what we chose not to surrender, what we built, sometimes barefoot and bleeding from the ashes. And if you're lucky, if you're brave enough, you might just find your own house like that, or build it. A house that learns to breathe again because of you, because of love, and because finally you chose to stay.